Okay, the League of Voters is a nonpartisan. We are nonpartisan in that we do not endorse political candidates or political parties, but we do take positions on issues, and one of those issues being an informed electorate. In order to achieve that goal of an informed electorate, we need access to trustworthy information and the ability to discern that trustworthy information. So what we'll do is the second half, we'll take questions. So if you could put your questions in the chat. Dr. Chen, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me. I'm going to see if I can share. I have a little bit of kind of a presentation PowerPoint. Let me see if this will let me do that. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. That works for me. So I'm just going to do, I haven't timed this out, so hopefully it'll be about 25 minutes. If not, it'll be a little less. And leave time for questions and things like that. Thank you again for having me. This is part of my specialization in what I do in my research. And I'm also teaching a class this winter on misinformation and conspiracy theories. So I'll get to put a lot of this even further into practice. And I've taught this at various points in the past to students as well. So let's see, there we go. That can work. So I think easiest thing to do kind of here is to start off with some terms that we use in political science, and then kind of kind of basing off of what I've been asked to do, I'm going to do sort of why do we believe a lot of misinformation, or why is misinformation believed and shared? Where do we get it, right? How is it spread? And then some questions about kind of the social media, new media, challenges like AI and things like that. So I'll try to cover this all in the next 25 minutes. And if I don't get to something, we'll cover it in the Q&A. So some of the key terms that we work with in political science, right? We differentiate. One of the big ones, right, is ignorance, which is simply not knowing something, and that's I think an important piece to what we often think about, right? It's not, when we're talking about misinformation, we're not talking about people who simply don't know something. We're really talking about people sharing information that is factually incorrect. Tied into misinformation is the work on conspiracy theories. This is, this idea that there are actors kind of working in secret to try to get something accomplished. What I'm really going to focus on today is misinformation, right? Factual beliefs, things that people believe are fact, but are actually false, or that the best publicly available information simply says are wrong. Misinformation, lots of misinformation out there. Disinformation, we think of as kind of intentionally spreading misinformation, right? So disinformation campaigns are really about the effective spread of misinformation or false information. And you'll hear terms sort of thrown about, things like fake news or things like that. They're all kind of sort of catch-all terms for misinformation, disinformation, things like that. I think more importantly is, why do we, and we being the royal we, why do we believe in misinformation, or why do we believe this kind of why do we believe information is factual when it really is not? And at least in sort of my view, and in the view of a lot of the people studying this in political science, the simple answer is psychology, right? There are numerous sort of psychological aspects of sort of the way we interact with other human beings that make it much more likely for us to believe misinformation, right? There's lots of different pieces. I'm not going to talk about these in depth. I'm going to talk about two big pieces in a second, but there's simple pieces, right? There's the assumption of truth, which is simply when we see some information, when we hear a story, our natural inclination is to assume that it's true. We don't just generally assume people are lying. So our natural inclination is to say, yeah, okay, accept it as truth until proven otherwise. We get other things, right? Sources. There's a really strong source effect. So if it's somebody that you trust, if it's a credible source in your mind, we're more likely to believe it. One of the things that we see a lot these days is what can sort of be termed sort of scientific window dressing, right? If you put up a graph or you put up some numbers, even if they don't really mean anything, or you use you use words like, you use an equation or something. It may have no basis in fact, but people tend to believe that kind of that kind of information because it has kind of a veneer of science to it. Uh, you know, Stories are much more impactful in our minds than facts. So, somebody tells a story about something that happened, some kind of information or something they learned, that tends to make us believe what we're hearing. And simple facts make us, less like we don't necessarily just kind of accept facts. Stories, anecdotes, things like that are far more persuasive. One of the big ones we talk about, something called naive realism. This is also a problem for us psychologically. This is that we think of ourselves as objective, even if we think other people aren't, right? So, as much as we might say, well, yeah, I get it. I get all of the aspects of psychology, but I think I can do it. I can be objective. I can understand what is true from what is false. So we tend to overestimate our ability to understand, to be objective. And then the final, simple piece is that we tend to just have a blind spot to our own biases. That all being said, I tend to think of sort of two big pieces to the misinformation puzzle in American politics. And these are aspects that we really don't have a great solution to, unfortunately. The first, and I think the one that we keep coming back to as political scientists, is something called motivated reasoning. Simply put, we are far more likely to believe information, accept information that confirms what our prior beliefs are. Second piece of this is kind of emotional information, right? Emotionally charged information, things that make us feel angry or upset or really happy, much easier to remember, much more likely to be shared. That motivated reasoning piece is a big one for what we're talking about here. When we talk about the motivations that we have in terms of information, uh, we always have some type of desire or motivation for what we want to get out of information. We can be what's called accuracy motivated, which is trying to come to the best, most accurate decision, or we can be directionally motivated, that is trying to confirm our prior beliefs. The unfortunate thing about this is most people think that they are being accuracy motivated. Most people think, oh yeah, I'm trying to get all of the information, put it together, and come to the most accurate belief. But even if you think you're doing that, most people are actually directionally motivated. Most people are much more likely to believe, remember, and accept information that confirms their previous beliefs, and much more likely to reject and counter argue information that counters that. And so when we encounter misinformation, when we encounter that and disinformation, if it's something that helps kind of remind us of what we believe and it reinforces our existing beliefs, we will tend to accept it without being particularly critical of it. And that's I think problematic. And so motivated reasoning is probably the number one driver of belief in misinformation and why it is that it is so sticky and so widely shared in American politics. So that's kind of the initial sort of psychology piece. Now, the big questions that I think were posed to me is kind of where are we getting it from, right? Where does this misinformation come from? And in some sense, it comes, some of the disinformation comes from, outside actors, foreign agents, things like that. Some of it is simply a function of the media or the way that we misinterpret the media often. Um, the when we talk about the way that misinformation and things like that spread through the media, and I think the media is probably one of the biggest culprits, we can kind of break it up into two ways, right? Um, the first type of media we might call sort of traditional media. This is television, news, things like that. Um, if we we think back, we remember the days of what we call the big three, right? ABC, NBC, CBS. At that time, television covered sort of roughly the same things at the same time every night. And if you had the TV on in your house or your family did, you kind of passively learned from the news. You maybe weren't sitting down even watching the news, but you would hear it in the background or something like that. Right? We mostly uh people got roughly the same information. And when we think about what it means, what are the kinds of aspects that make people particularly good citizens, right? It's some type of sort of shared identity or shared common experiences, right? Which we get from, a shared media environment, learning about the same things at this, roughly the same time, as well as being knowledgeable about politics and being engaged in politics, right? That's what we often think of as kind of what makes a good citizen. Ironically, having those kind of limited media choices helped create this, right? Everyone, regardless, if you had a television and you had it on, you got mostly the same information. So we had a shared knowledge base. We had a shared engagement, and we had a shared identity. I remember the big decisions in my house growing up was what we watched, and it was based mostly on which anchor you liked, not on any kind of knowledge about where the media source kind of landed. But then, of course, something happened, right? Something happened to the media system. We had deregulation. That was the big one, right? Media deregulation um, led to basically a loosening of the rules that these news networks had to follow. We got cable news as well. Cable news not subject to the same uh, constraints as broadcast television, and we had profit motives, right? And so the media became much more driven by the need to make money. And we got more bias, right? More bias into the media. We see this in this is not simply a new phenomenon. We've seen it consistently. The media tends to fall victim to misinformation as well, or inaccurate information. Lance Bennett has a phenomenal book. I have it right here, called "When the Press Fails," and essentially tracing how the media tended to just follow along with what the administration was saying regarding the Iraq War, or regarding things like Hurricane Katrina, and the media just tends to follow agencies or government sources without being particularly challenging to that. So there are media biases that enter into this. So we've got this kind of environment that has led to a very different type of media that we're going to see on television or on radio or things like that. Um, we also get this what I often talk about as like the media choice conundrum, right? We think, great, we've got more cable news, we've got more options. People can go find, we have the internet, we have all these places for people to find information. That should make people more knowledgeable, more engaged, things like that. And the problem that we run into is that for some people, that's true. for other people, it's the exact opposite. Marcus Pryor has done this, right? And what he found in this is, one of those fancy graphs from his book. Basically, for people who didn't have cable or internet access, this is done in the 90s before cable and internet was a much more common thing. So for people who had just sort of traditional broadcast television, it didn't matter if you loved hearing the news or hated the news, right? Um, if you ranked the news as your favorite thing or your least favorite thing, those people were generally had about the same level of knowledge about politics. What happens though is when you get more choice, when you have access to both cable and internet, those people who are really, really interested in the news become much more knowledgeable. Those people who really dislike the news become much less knowledgeable. They have options, right? If you hate the news, right now, you don't have to see it, right? You don't have to see any of the news, and you don't have to see misinformation either, because you can completely opt out of learning about politics. So there's also there's this kind of conundrum that is built into what we're talking about here. What the other thing you can do, though, and this is where the misinformation piece comes in, it's much easier to find even traditional television or radio media sources that agree with what you already believe. And this has been one of the big problems and one of the reasons that misinformation can spread so easily. Even if a news network inadvertently shares something that turns out to be false, if the people who are tuned in are already inclined to believe what they're hearing, they're much more likely to remember that information, to share that misinformation, to spread that misinformation, even if it turns out to be false. And so, and in a way that if it's a source that you trust, but is not confirming, hasn't had a history of confirming your prior beliefs, it's going to be much less impactful. So, a Democrat watching MSNBC or a Republican watching Fox News, those sources, because they have a tendency to have anchors or shows that are generally in line with the beliefs of their viewers, information, if it's misinformation on there, is going to be more likely to spread and catch on and proliferate. So from the traditional media side, we have a lot going on. The other side of media, and I think maybe the even more troubling or problematic way that we see a lot of this misinformation spread is through social media and new media. Similar psychology to traditional media, but now we have a medium that basically lacks a journalistic ethics code. And without a code of ethics, and in fact, without even necessarily verified journalists, you get this kind of spreading of misinformation that can happen without any consequence. Not that there's a lot of consequences for television anchors, but there's essentially no consequence to spreading misinformation on social media. And we add to that a really unique challenge, which is one, the algorithms that are used, right? What I see on Facebook is different than what my wife sees on Facebook and what my aunt sees on Facebook. These social media companies show us things that they want us to see. Because they show us things that we think we're going to click on and be interested in and spend more time on their site, because that's going to get them more money. The other challenge is that we're friends with people. These are, we form these social connections. They're our friends. And so if your friend shares something, that's a credible source. That's somebody that you're likely to want to believe and maybe then share that information that you've learned. So we've got this kind of double-edged sword of the media companies, social media companies, pushing information they think we want to see, and really credible sources because these people are our friends. So, it's one of those things where we say, well, okay, so maybe we just get rid of social media. Maybe we just ditch it. Maybe we just say, no, we don't need this anymore. This, I think, is perhaps an overreaction, right? Um, I wouldn't say be quite so fast to just say, well, we get rid of social media and things will be solved. Um, Cass Sunstein famously has written a lot about social media and said it's not actually that social media in the right circumstances can be really important and can be a really good way to learn about things. Um, but you need to meet some, it needs to meet some principles, right? We should see things that we wouldn't normally choose to see. Uh, all of the people, the citizens should have similar experiences on social media, and citizens should be able to tell truth from lies. Right? If you have a social media environment where these kind of conditions are met, then social media can be a real important piece of the democratic experience, right? You see more information, you have shared experiences, and you can say, no, that one's true, that one's a lie. I'm gonna go with the thing that's true. Of course, for any of us who are on social media, we know none of these things are actually are none of these conditions are actually met by contemporary social media, right? We social media companies are profit driven. They want to make money. So they're not going to show us things that we wouldn't want to see. People absolutely don't have similar experiences on social media, and the evidence suggests it's difficult, if not impossible, to completely fact check information. Right? Fact checking information on social media is deeply, deeply problematic and hard to accomplish. And if you look at some of the legal framework around this, we can't even hold social media companies responsible for misinformation that is spread because of some provisions in the Communications Act that hold them essentially harmless for information that's posted on their websites that is posted by other people, right? So we do have this kind of environment where where social media could be a really positive aspect. But in general, it's a place where misinformation is spread and proliferates and is widely accepted by people. And it's uniquely challenging because the people sharing information are people we consider friends. They're people that we trust for the most part. And so even more so than perhaps a television anchor or a radio show host, we are really inclined to believe our friends, and we're much less likely to fact check something our friends might post on our friends or our family might post on social media. So this is kind of walking, hopefully getting kind of where we kind of stand in terms of media sources, the spread of misinformation, and also why we tend to believe misinformation. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll happily open it up to questions, is some of the what well, I guess there's two more things. Kind of new challenges, and then is there anything we can do about this, right? Is there anything we can do to kind of be better at discerning misinformation or things like that? In terms of kind of new challenges, there was two big two questions that were posed to me ahead of time. Challenges from different sort of foreign and domestic sources, as well as the role that artificial intelligence might play. So I'm going to take those kind of one by one. Um, the first one I will say is kind of foreign and domestic sources of disinformation. And this is kind of I kind of want to split this one. Domestic sources, right? So our government agencies and candidates, we don't see them engage in a ton of intentional disinformation spread. That doesn't mean they don't spread misinformation. Absolutely, especially among candidates. We see candidates do a lot of spreading of misinformation or half truths or things that are not outright lies, but are maybe a fabrication or a kind of a stretching of the truth. Absolutely, we see that from domestic sources. But what we don't see as much is kind of intentionally spreading misinformation in order to create chaos or do something like that. from domestic sources. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but there are just simply more potential consequences for, a Senate campaign that purposefully spreads disinformation. If they get found out, there are more sort of consequences that they may face. I do think there's a real challenge that we face from foreign sources of misinformation and disinformation. We've seen it. We saw it in the 2016 election with information spread by Russia and Russian troll farms. If you're interested in that, Kathleen Hall Jamieson is a phenomenal rhetorical scholar. I believe she's at the University of Pennsylvania, and she wrote an entire book called Cyber War, basically on Russian hackers and trolls in the 2016 election. Very, very detailed description of the way that Russia essentially went about sowing chaos and disinformation in the 2016 election. We're seeing it from Russia. We see it from China. This most recent election, we're seeing Iranian misinformation and disinformation too. And what I often say is like there's kind of an easy story and a difficult an easy explanation and a difficult explanation to this kind of foreign involvement. The kind of easy explanation that I think a lot of people tend to accept is these countries have a presidential candidate that they prefer, and they're trying to get that person elected. That's the kind of the easy story, but it's the story that doesn't, that really doesn't, I think, hold as much empirical or scientific weight. What we do see is that there's probably the more accurate explanation is that what these countries want is dissent, lower trust in the US government from US citizens, discord, disagreement, infighting. A US government that is unable to agree on basic facts, that is unable to agree on what is true and what is false, is a government that is less effective at pushing back against nefarious other powers, right? Iran can do more if the US government has two parties that are fighting themselves and disagreeing over basic information, right? They can be freer to do the things they want to do. That I think is a more accurate understanding of why these countries engage in the spread of disinformation. It's not simply that they want Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to win. It's that they want disagreement. They want the US to be fighting within itself so that we can't turn attention to what they are doing. And so that's what we see a lot in kind of where that disinformation or why disinformation and misinformation is spread by these foreign sources. So, first piece, foreign and domestic sources. My concern really lies is in the foreign sources because there's only so much that we can do about it. And they are getting more and more sophisticated in the way that they spread that information. And again, if you get a chance to read Jamison's book, you'll really understand how sophisticated the efforts were even in 2016, right? In 2016, Russia sent actual human beings to protests on both sides of the protest to create the impression of disagreement at protests, right? Not just online, but actually in person to create this kind of conflict. The other piece that the other kind of new challenge we might think about is the role of AI or artificial intelligence. And I might be in the minority here, but the truth is I'm not terribly concerned about the role that AI plays in politics. And here's why. there's one exception, right? Video and photo manipulation. I think that's a problem. But here's why I'm not that concerned. Politicians have been misattributing words and actions to their opponents for centuries, right? AI is essentially another tool for politicians to engage in this kind uh, of spread of misinformation about your opponent. But they don't really need help creating that information. They can make up, politicians have been making up slightly inaccurate information about their opponents for as long as politicians have existed. Um, and the consequences, the backlash that politicians can face if they're actually using AI to, if, when Donald Trump says, well, the crowds at uh, Harris's rallies are AI generated, right? The backlash that the Harris campaign would face if they were actually using AI to create fake crowds is really severe. So there's not as much of an incentive among politicians to use AI in these kind of really extreme ways. So I think it's something we have to watch. I think there's absolutely the potential that it can be a real problem, but I think largely what it is just another tool in the bag for politicians who want to engage in kind of making, winning elections. I will say my one exception is video and photo manipulation, right? And we saw this most recently, that high profile most recently, with the AI generated images and text of Taylor Swift endorsing Donald Trump, right? She actually comes out and endorses Kamala Harris, but there's a series of AI manipulated and then widely shared misinformation that she's endorsing Donald Trump. We have not done, we as political scientists, or we as psychologists have not done a great job at looking at how this kind of visual misinformation spreads and is accepted and is understood. I'm actually starting some work with a colleague in psychology at DU, Max Weisbush, on trying to look at kind of the effect of the spread of misinformation through videos and photos and things like that, because we just don't have good information, good knowledge on this at this time. So I would keep an eye on AI. I don't think it's fundamentally changed the way that campaigns use and spread information, but I think it has some potential to, depending on how it grows and depending on what campaigns or candidates, or especially foreign governments, how they might choose to use it. So, right, is there anything we can do? Right? Is there anything we can do to kind of counteract the spread of misinformation? One thing that I think we can think really strongly about is better investment in public broadcasting. Public broadcasting has a very, very small share of the media market in the United States, but public broadcasting doesn't have the same profit motive, right? If you are funded by the federal government, you don't necessarily need to draw in advertisers, and you can draw a wider type of audience because you don't have to worry about turning off some people and slightly lowering your audience share. So public broadcasting is one of the best ways, across the world that we've seen to try to combat misinformation, because it takes away the profit motive uh, from media organizations. There's other things we can do to kind of counter misinformation, right? We can provide alternatives, factual alternatives to people. We can explain why things are false, not just say it's false, right? Saying, well, actually, you're wrong isn't as good as saying, here is why that actually is not true. We can use sources that are credible, right, to the person who's believing the misinformation. We can correct information in a way that doesn't challenge what they believe about the world. And we can do something that that we can kind of think about as like fostering skepticism, basically encouraging people to be skeptical of information that they read. If we are all a little bit more skeptical and ask questions about information before we just accept it, we will become better at countering misinformation. Finally, what can we do for ourselves? How can we spot fake news? And these are PDFs have been put forth. This is from Library Association, right? Consider the source, read past the headlines, see who the author is, what they've written in the past. Make sure it's not old news. Think about your own biases. Think about sources. Make sure it's not satire. And then of course ask experts. If you're confused or if you're not sure about the source, ask somebody who's an expert. So we can do that to think about fake news. On the Media has produced what they call their breaking news handbook. So in the immediate aftermath of some like breaking news, right? How do we avoid spreading or accepting misinformation about something that's breaking, right? Accept that news outlets are going to get some stuff wrong immediately as things are as breaking news is happening. Don't tend to trust anonymous sources, right? Anonymous sources tend to not be particularly good sources. Um, Stories that cite other news outlets as the source, not great. I like number 4. There's almost never a second shooter. This is kind of the Occam's razor explanation. Basically, the more complicated explanations are usually not as accurate as the simple explanation. Looking at language the media uses, this is, I think, really kind of telling, right? We're getting reports doesn't really mean anything. It could mean anything. Seeking confirmation means they don't have it yet. They aren't sure. And ABC News has learned means yes, we have this, we have this information, or we're really going out and claiming this. And then just do things like look for different sources. Uh, Look at newspapers and television from Minneapolis. And then be careful of fakers, fake news, and don't share information until you are confident that it is accurate. And with that, I think I'm right about at 30 minutes. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so you can, or maybe stop share. There we go. Um, and I will happily answer questions or anything else as we go.
Well, that was great. Thank you. That's a lot of information you packed into those
I
minutes.
tried.
You did. Um, so there is a question in the chat. Mary would like the titles and authors of the books you mentioned. Can you
Yes.
put those in the chat or
Yeah, I can
tell?
put that in. The first one was When the Press Fails by Lance Bennett, typing, Regina Lawrence, and Stephen Livingston. And the other one is Cyber War by Kathleen Hall Jameson. And I have other books that I could always share if you have other questions about other ones. I brought kind of a stack here. And yeah, I see. Yeah, PBS and MBR. Yeah, they get a relatively limited amount of their funding from the federal government. They get a lot more from private and public donations. But again, the big piece, even if they don't get it all from the federal government, it's absolutely important that the profit motive is lowered among public broadcasting. And I think that's one of the big pieces to what we see is that if you don't have a need to draw in viewers who are and entertain in a way that something like many of our cable news outlets are designed, you get a system that is a little bit more likely to be to not spread kind of misinformation and things like that.
Kathy?
Yeah, I was wondering what, I just saw something come in about a poll. What do you think about polls and how to think about that with mis and disinformation and how that
Yeah,
might be intertwined?
yeah, absolutely. So we are obviously going to see poll after poll after poll throughout this electoral season. Um, my best advice on polling is the first thing you should look for if you are if you're trying to understand what a poll if a poll is a high quality poll. High quality polls are going to share basic information about their methodology. Somewhere in the article should be a link to the polling agency and have things like, you know, a response rate, the questions that are asked, if there is a paid sponsor of the poll, things like that. You know, you should be most trustworthy. Um, you should be most trustworthy of polls that are that share that information, right? Reputable polling agencies share response rates. They share, you know, their demographics, what we call top lines, right? If you can click in and see this is how people have responded. If all they're sharing is their interpretation of the results and there's nowhere that you can see a little bit of information about the poll, it's not necessarily a bad poll, but it should give you pause. It should give you, you know, you should reconsider whether that is you know, the highest quality poll. The other big advice on polls I always say is any one poll, and this is just, you know, me as a methodologist, any one poll can be wrong.
Mhm.
That's why the best way that we can think about polls is in these kind of aggregate, whether it's poll aggregators or models that try to you know, create a forecast. Um, any one poll can be wrong, and by definition, the way that polling happens, a certain number of polls are just going to be outliers, and we simply don't know it from, you know, to how to tell if a poll is an outlier.
Right. Diana has a question.
Thank you. I've been yelling at the radio quite a bit today about the national news people calling this incident in Florida an apparent assassination attempt when there were no shots fired. The guy wasn't next to the gun, and all this. And I think they jumped to conclusions in that. And it just tells me the national news media gets caught up in the situation too.
Yeah, I think that's a really, you know, that's a really indicative example of, I think, exactly one of the problems we have with a media environment that is, you know, that is profit driven, right? Is that if you know, a story that says you know, second attempted assassination of presidential candidate Donald Trump is more likely to get people to click and read it than to say individual found in bushes at Mar-a-Lago or Trump National Golf Club, right? With ties to you know, who might, like, it's just it's the language that they use is far more likely to get people to, and it's a race, right? Because if one media organization doesn't cover it in that way, they're going to get less people clicking on their stories, less people clicking through their ads, and thus less money. And so once one organization does it, there's kind of an arms race, to so to speak, of people trying to, you know, news organizations trying to be on the same, you know, level playing field in that way. Um, yeah. Let me look at, I think there's a couple questions um, in the chat. Okay. Yeah, self-censoring. I do think that you do get some, even on something like PBS or NPR, you're going to get some self-censoring depending on who's paying for it. Hopefully you get some disclosure of that information. Again, you can, with a publicly funded organization, the hope is that you could have a little bit more requirements around disclosure. I pay zero attention to polls. Who answers polls? Most people have cell phones that don't answer their phones. People on the streets. I don't know anyone who's ever been polled. And this is the big challenge with polling these days, right? Even in the 90s and early 2000s, response rates to polls were in the 10-20% of people who were contacted, right? And so to get 1,000-person poll, you might contact 10,000 people. Response rates now are around 1%, which means to get 1,000-person sample, you need to contact about 100,000 people, right? It's a huge undertaking to engage in this kind of polling. That said, right, what I think is, I'm not somebody who discounts polls, because if you think about it, despite the challenges that these polling agencies face, they're relatively accurate, right? We've seen some polling misses, what we call correlated misses, especially in 2016, but national polls have actually been not terribly wrong, right? A 3-point miss is not particularly out of the norm for national polling. And so, it's what I think is amazing is given the challenges faced by polling agencies, that we still get any kind of utility out of them. And we do seem to get utility. They do seem to capture kind of changes in national mood. And we've seen that they are, the misses are not all in one direction. They look maybe a little bit more volatile than they did in the 90s and 80s, but polls today are not that different, not that much more inaccurate than they were at a time when people were much more likely to answer their phones. So it is like there is a lot of difficulty in conducting polls these days. I'm mostly just kind of amazed that they are that they can get anything useful out of them, and we do seem to get something useful out of them. Let's see, how can one discern a photo or video as being fake? That is a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. There are some things we can look for. Again, this is some of the stuff that I want to, do a little bit more research on. As far as like photos or videos, if you've done work in Photoshop, I've done some. I was photojournalism major for a little while. You can tell little things about how it's done, but those aren't foolproof. What I think is the best way to know if a photo or video is fake is try to find something else that corroborates the story, right? Any one photo, you might not be able to tell that a photo of Taylor Swift with a Trump hat on is fake, but you may say, but wait a second, there's no other media coverage about this. This is Taylor Swift. She's gonna be covered. And so what's probably a better way than trying to figure out if a specific photo or video is fake is try to corroborate the information. Try to get a second or a third source. Why do I think mainstream media doesn't routinely counter misinformation, especially related to claims by politicians? I think part of it is countering misinformation is a difficult thing to do. And even when they do counter it, it's not a particularly just providing a counter, a fact check tends to not actually sway that many people, right? Fact checks are, I think, something that we like to see, but don't have a lot of sort of demonstrable influence on somebody's actual belief in the information. And so I think it's partly that, and they're really, again, it comes down to incentives. What's the incentive that a media organization has to counter information by politicians? If all it's going to get them is the one thing I would say is it might get them added attention, in the sense that if a politician says, I can't believe they're doing this, how are they saying that what I'm saying is fake? How can they do that? Maybe you get a little bit more attention to your news organization, but is that the attention you want for your news organization? So I think there's some of it is just there isn't an incentive structure. The other thing is fact checking is a really kind of time intensive, and oftentimes expensive process, to have somebody do this. And so it does require somebody, an organization paying somebody to spend their time doing this. And so especially for newspapers starkly declining revenues, and subscription rates means that a lot of newspapers, and media consolidation just simply don't have the resources to do this. And that's why you do see kind of these sort of non-partisan, non-profit organizations trying to come out and do some of this fact checking. I think because it's a way for to avoid having to put that burden on media organizations. We've all heard the eating dogs and cats story. What would you say to correct this to someone whom this confirms their worldview? I think, this is what I would say is, right, it does confirm their worldview, because it's coming from trusted sources. To some extent, right, this is the challenge. And what we look at in, so much of the work in political science has been trying to figure out how we can counter misinformation effectively. And the short answer is we haven't come to a good answer, right? We just don't have a great way to counter this information. I think what I would, if I were in this situation and somebody said, well, okay, this is what I heard. I think the easiest, is it going to be 100% effective? No, but I think, you can say, well, the police in Springfield, Ohio have said, there's no reports about this, right? And you can say, you can try to say, well, this is information that was spread online, and we haven't seen any kind of corroboration from media outlets. The city manager has said this is not true. Depending on, I don't actually know if the city manager position in Springfield, Ohio is a partisan position, but if it is, and the person happens to be, a Republican or conservative, given that that's where the story is coming from, the misinformation is coming from, you might be able to play on that, but I doubt the city manager position is partisan. You can look to things, you might be able to point to say, listen, even J.D. Vance has said this is, potentially not true, and but the short answer is, for somebody who is invested in their existing beliefs, which we all are, it's much harder to move somebody off of a piece of misinformation. And so the best we can often do is try to explain, try to kind of present the information as we have it, try to do it in a way that still kind of confirms or accords with their worldview, and accept that there are times when misinformation just isn't going to be countered. The last thing I'll say on that is that there's also some evidence that some people engage in what we term sort of partisan cheerleading, which is that they may know the information is not true. They may know. They may say, yeah, obviously, everything, all the reports say this is not actually happening. But it's a way for me to show how strong I am to this cause, right? How committed I am is to repeat this and to stay, to keep with this information, even if I know it's not true. I know it's not true, but the more I talk about this, the more you fight me on it, and the more it kind of reinforces my identity as a person who who supports, in this case it supports Donald Trump or supports the Republican Party, right? Or vice versa for misinformation for the Democratic Party, right? And so there is some evidence of what we call partisan cheerleading. People knowing the information is false, but still at least repeating it or sticking with their belief, at least publicly, because it it's a way to show the strength of your commitment to the cause. Okay, what is current legislation or regulation to curb social media companies from allowing the spread of dangerous disinformation? My knowledge, not much. I mean, the short answer is you see some politicians talking about it. There was a little while there where it looked like there might be some bipartisan movement to change Section 230 of the Communications Act, but we really just don't have a lot there. Part of it is because there aren't a lot of legal avenues for the federal government, for government in general, to sort of punish social media companies. Again, because they're protected from information that is posted on their sites by users, right? So if they're not the ones posting the information, then they're basically immune from from any of the kind of libel laws or things like that. We've seen some various attempts at trying to find some type of way to regulate these companies. But the short answer, right, is there isn't much, and it's not really clear what the legal standing of the federal government is to do this without changing the Communication Act. And these are large, rich companies with immense lobbying power. And so if something was going to fundamentally alter their business model, they're likely to oppose that and to spend their money to lobby against it. And so I think our best hope, and I don't know that I put a lot of hope in this, but our best hope is that social media companies do some kind of like self-regulation. I don't think that's going to happen necessarily, but I think that's our best hope, because I think there isn't really currently a lot of bipartisan or even kind of generalized belief that the government has either the will or even the ability to regulate these companies in that way, which is just kind of the sad truth of where we stand with social media companies today.
Okay. Anybody have any, Diana?
Your Facebook feed and your husband's feed are not. Yes.
That was a big one to me.
Yeah, very, very different. Even, my wife and I have similar political leanings, and she gets a lot, but she, the thing to remember is, these social media companies get information on what we search for online. So, I play golf, so I get, golf related things on my Facebook feed. She gardens, she gets gardening related Facebook things. The gardening I do is vegetables, so I get vegetable garden. Like the feeds are so hyper personalized. In fact, one of the things I do, this is if any of you are on YouTube and have you like watched a lot of things on YouTube, if you open YouTube in a private browser, so you go to like new private window or something like that, and then open YouTube and click on, I think it's like recommendations or something. You can see the videos that are the most watched videos at that time. And when I do that, I'm like, oh, I'm like, what the rest of the world is seeing is just completely different than what I see. So yeah, the experiences that we have are just radically different.
Okay, any other questions, anybody? We're at our cutoff time here. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Chen. This was great.
Of course, I hope this was helpful. And
was.
I hope it was interesting to some of you. I know I kind of rambled a lot, but
No, I think it was great. There was a lot of information and very interesting. So thank you.
and always feel free. I'm going to put my email in here.
Oh, okay.
If you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. Philip.chen@du.edu, 1L in Philip, as my mom would always say.
Okay, that's good. Okay, thank you very much.
Of
Thank
course,
you
thanks.
so much.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
really gave us a lot to think about.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course.